Good morning. My name is Amber van Aurich. I am a researcher, writer, artist, and lesbian feminist activist. I would like to thank Anna, Helen, and IWD Engine for offering a platform to myself, those speaking this weekend, and the countless others who have spoken at IWD Engine events. A bit about my background. I'm also a committee member of Reclaim the Night Perth, a political platform for women which, in my city, is historically a majority lesbian-run grassroots organisation focusing on public and private forms of male violence. Importantly, Reclaim the Night is about reclaiming and reasserting women's rights to space without male violence. This is an issue I am very passionate about and has informed my interest in other forms of spaces, specifically my current research into lesbian-only space. Today I will be talking about lesbian separatism, specifically the lessons learned from one example of solidarity and community among women in the political and personal fight for women's and lesbians' rights. I'm going to explain what lesbian separatism is, briefly how it came about, its consequences, and the contributions separatists make to community, identity acceptance, and cultural development. Lastly, I will discuss how the separatist experience can be applied today. What can we take away from this discussion and apply to our lives now? I would like to quickly mention, if anyone is interested in reading about the experiences of detransition, in the words of detransitioned women, or seeking resources about this, please check out the website areyouaskingwhy.com. Since the 1970s, when it began, the definition has developed and expanded. The general consensus is lesbian separatism is the physical, emotional, and/or psychological separation from males, and often heterosexual women too. However, that very basic definition can be expanded into two forms: graduated and complete separation. Graduated separatism is like a continuum of actions, taking many forms with a varied level of commitment. This includes, firstly, a realignment of identification and commitment, which means no longer abiding by patriarchy, uncritical of its concepts of womanhood, and participating in its culture. Instead, it is choosing to align yourself with women, with our concepts, ideas, history, and worldview, building a culture that centers our needs. Secondly, it includes an avoidance of patriarchal influence. This can mean only reading books written by women, watching film and TV that centers women's stories, and only listening to women musicians. Thirdly, on the furthest end of the continuum is the withdrawal from male company, support, or participation. This could mean not supporting male-dominated organizations, choosing ones which center women. Or when organising an event and looking for speakers, you would choose a woman over a man, or no longer spending your free time with men, choosing to do so with women only instead. Furthermore, graduated separatism involves the creation of women-only spaces for all women to access, whether separatist, lesbian, or not. Whereas complete separatism is the total removal of males and patriarchal culture in all forms from one's life to the best of one's ability. This is the most well-known example, the living sustainably on the land in a women-only culture type of separatism. Thus, it is also the most difficult to achieve. And as you can see on the slide, these two types encompass many different examples of how you can practice separatism. So how did it come about? In the 1960s, lesbians were facing discrimination, silencing, and being ignored in both the gay liberation and women's liberation movements, the former as women, the latter as homosexuals. In response, by 1970, lesbians carved out an alternative space for themselves. For many groups, especially in the US, whose influence spread across the globe, they were inspired by civil rights and the Black Power movement. The practice of developing a distinct identity-based culture, having a positive identity and personal pride, and the merging of political theory and action to achieve social change were some of the ways in which they were influenced by these movements. In addition, it is important to note that although lesbians ideologically separated from the women's liberation movement, many remained politically active in women's liberation. They did not leave the movement, rather they created additional spaces for themselves. So now that you have a definition and an understanding of how it came about, let's talk about lesbian separatism's goals. Each group of separatists likely had their own goals, but with international networks, there were common threads. These included, firstly, challenging the idea that women are inherently heterosexual and want to be bonded to men, also called heterosexism. They did this by making lesbianism visible both publicly and in history. Secondly, providing women an alternative way to live outside the heterosexual nuclear family, so husband, wife, 2 or more children, showing women that they could live well, they could thrive, without relying on men for anything. Thirdly, to develop a distinct women-focused culture and community through making music, art, literature, film, and spaces with no men. Fourth, to acknowledge differences among women and see them as a strength. And finally, to end male supremacy, challenging the idea that men are inherently superior. This also meant challenging the idea that men have any right to access women. Indeed, this, I think, is the central tenet of separatism. By denying men access to women, to our labour, our love, our attention, our bodies, and our energy, we can shift the power back into women's hands. But how did this work in practice? Lesbian separatism has been happening since the 1970s. That's 5 decades of lessons that can be learned. However, despite its length and its recent resurgence, separatism as a practice has waned. So as I discuss the lessons we've learned, I'll be focusing on the 1970 to 1989 era. So what worked? This is by no means an exhaustive list, this is just what I found from my research. Firstly, they were able to make safe spaces for lesbians and for all women. These spaces were integral to the development of community and women-centered culture. From those examples mentioned earlier, you can see the vast array of spaces they were able to create which were distinctly women-only, with some of them also being lesbian-only. By being surrounded by women and women's culture, lesbians could develop a positive sense of self and identity as women and lesbians. They redefined what it meant to be a lesbian woman, from the negative ones created by patriarchy to positive ones created by themselves. In addition, there was considerable bonding and solidarity among women. They felt that they could accomplish anything because they had each other. For example, men's attempts of intimidation through harassment, assault, or threats of violence could be challenged through the presence of large numbers of women together. Furthermore, lesbians increased their self-esteem. Women came to appreciate their bodies, how they looked and acted naturally. They abandoned patriarchal forms of dress, makeup, perfume, etc. in favour of more comfortable and practical clothes and products. A third element of separatism that worked was non-hierarchical structures, often in the form of collectives. Everyone had equal voice on key issues in homes and organising committees. Debate happened all the time. However, I think it's important to note that although the practice of democratic, non-hierarchical structures did and continues to work for organising, it should be acknowledged that it didn't and does not work in every circumstance. For example, those which do not acknowledge difference and how difference can shape the way we communicate, through things like trauma, neurodiversity, mental illness, cultural background. In these kinds of situations, no matter how democratic we try to be, the loudest and most adamant voices often get their way. This may not be a constraint in the short term, however in the long term it can lead to loss of connection, resentments, and fracturing. A fourth element which worked was the skill building. Abandoning the idea that there were skills that only men could do, women began teaching themselves and each other things like mechanics, woodworking, electrical skills, building and carpentry, plumbing, etc. In addition, women learned how to grow food, look after the land, make music, art, film, and self-publish books and magazines. This gave women an incredible sense of independence, autonomy, and self-sufficiency. Lastly, while lesbian separatists were building a strong community and a woman-centered culture, they were still engaging in activism. They protested Anzac Day, particularly the glorification of war, and highlighted the issue of rape during war. They ran Reclaim the Night marches. They protested sexist ads and institutions. They made street theatre using humour to inform the public about the misogyny of our society. They protested nuclear weapons and military bases through peace events. They educated the youth through school visits and lectures at universities. They started and ran women's shelters, refuges, rape crisis centres, telephone lines and health centres for all women. And they often did all of this without any funding. As with anything, there were conflicts and difficulties which affected the success of the spaces and how long they lasted. Those that were shared with me and I read about in existing literature were twofold. Firstly, interpersonal conflict. Despite the goal of acknowledging difference and seeing it as a strength, there was a widespread assumption that all women shared common visions of liberation and of separation in addition to common values. This meant that when women's liberation had differences in vision and values, it led to tensions, fierce debate, and sometimes alienation. Furthermore, Women carried the patriarchal values of classism, racism, anti-Semitism, ableism, etc. with them to separatist spaces, causing conflict, particularly when these were ignored. Some women felt that they were not welcome in separatist spaces. Secondly, a major struggle, particularly in Australia, was a lack of resources. The example of Amazon Acres, a separatist land in New South Wales, demonstrates this. Because of the Australian environment and climate, in addition to its remote location, the women of Amazon Acres struggled to create a sustainable way to live. Getting goods back and forth from its remote location was difficult, as was attempts to grow food and maintain shelters. In addition, the lack of financial resources also caused struggles. Many women who lived separatist lives were low income, students, and on some form of government assistance. This meant long-term sustainability of organisations, places of residence, and livelihoods were difficult to maintain. However, from my research, it is clear that, despite these struggles, the women who lived separatist lives did not regret their choices, with the majority believing it to be a powerful and necessary action. What can we learn from all this? I believe the tactics used by lesbian separatists of the past towards community, safety, acceptance of their identities as lesbians and as women, and the development of a woman-centered culture are important lessons which we can consider in the present and the future. The importance of listening to others, open communication and debate among one another, and the acknowledgement of difference not only in experience and background, but also in communication style, are key lessons to take into any space, whether in person or online. We cannot get anywhere without this. Furthermore, acknowledging the negative impact of our male-defined culture, patriarchy, has on our psyches as women and girls is integral to our survival. I believe we cannot heal from it unless we come to understand ourselves outside of it. This can be done in a myriad of ways. The separatist example is just one of them, which has and continues to be effective in challenging male definitions and ideas about who we are, how we live, and what our purpose is. Lastly, lesbian separatism demonstrates that the widespread, prolific harm which men and boys enact onto women and girls can be challenged through a woman-centered community. A final lesson I think the feminist community as a whole can learn from highlighting such histories as I have today is that although lesbians created their own spaces, separating from men and sometimes straight women too, they continued to fight for all women's rights. There is a narrative among the feminist community, particularly when the topic of separatism is brought up, which is that separatism is a form of escapism, or running away into the bush, leaving the rest of womankind behind to fend for themselves. However, what the experiences of separatists have shown in this narrative, is this narrative is categorically untrue. Even those who lived on the land continued to contribute to the liberationist cause through protest, political actions, running organisations, and creating a vast amount of networks and works which were disseminated across the globe. And they continue to do so today. Thank you for listening to me talk.